morning, everyone. Who's excited for 45 more minutes of economic data and charts? Woo, right? Yes, let's go. This is going to be a good time. I think you should be excited because although I will be leveraging data and charts to educate and inform, I also hope to empower you. I hope to teach you some ways that you can leverage economic data to predict what's going to happen around the corner and to make better informed strategic decisions for your own business. But before we get to all of that, I want to point out a couple of things. Number one, my last name, Chausovsky, represents the fact that I was not born in this country. I'm originally from Kiev, Ukraine, and I emigrated to the United States in 1990 when I was 10 years old. Now, I know what you guys are probably thinking. Great, another Russian in our midst trying to tell us what to do. I assure you, Robert Mueller and his team looked into it. There's no collusion between ITR and the Russian government. But I do think that my perspective, my experience, my foreign upbringing does give me a unique perspective on the United States economy. I am very proud to be here. I feel very fortunate to have the opportunities that I have. And I want to start the presentation by recognizing how awesome America is, right? Because I think a lot of times we're constantly inundated by negativity. In media, online, in print, people love to tell us all the things that are wrong with this country, and very few people actually take the time to highlight how amazing this country really is. The fact that clearly and by far, based on personal experience, this is the best place in the world to live, to raise your families, and to conduct business. And so I hope that despite the fact that we're going to talk about economics, you will see some of that messaging carry through. I want to empower you, and I want to instill in you this belief that the future is quite bright for all of you here in Denver and for the United States economy as a whole. The other thing I want to point out is my title, Director of Speaking Services. I am not an economist by trade. I have an international business degree from the University of Texas at Austin and an MBA. And as Bruce mentioned, I spent 15 years prior to joining this current firm, ITR Economics, advising companies all around the world. So I want to talk to you about the economy in practical, sensible way. I want you to be able to walk away with some actionable steps, some things that you can actually do based on the economic information that will help you make better decisions as you traverse 2019 and certainly into 2020 as well. I start every presentation that I do by showing this slide. It's basically the report card for all of the major macroeconomic series forecasts that ITR produces. And the reason I do this is because I feel that since I'm claiming to be a soothsayer, to be able to predict the future, I feel it's only fair to share with you our past results. So what you can see here on the left-hand side, that's the major macroeconomic series. You can see both GDP, industrial production, some foreign indicators there, as well as core components of the economy, employment and retail sales and housing. The second column, duration, shows you how many months that particular forecast was in place when we compared the predicted value, when we generated the forecast, to the actual year-end 2018 number. Now, you'll notice it says preliminary results. Because of the government shutdown, some of the December data hasn't come out yet, so I can't claim that this is final 2018 numbers, but you can get a sense of what we've been able to accomplish. Because by looking at the accuracy column, you can see that we've been pretty good about foretelling what the economy is going to do. But more importantly than the accuracy, I think it's the duration. Most of our macro series forecasts have now been in place at least 2 years. So in addition to being a reliable source of information, we can be kind of that stake in the ground for you to base your decisions upon. We can be a true partner in making those strategic business decisions as you look towards the future. There's also a personal reason I like to start with this chart. I find it helps keep me a little bit grounded. You see, although I am relatively young, at 39 years of age, I married my high school sweetheart. So I've been now with the same woman for more than half my life, more than 20 years. And my wife is a native Texan, born and raised in Austin. She's a very strong-willed and opinionated woman whom I respect and admire very, very much. But I've come to find out over the last 20 years that whenever we have any kind of disagreement, when we don't see eye to eye, my personal accuracy rate at home sucks, okay, right? It may be 2% at best. So the good news for you is I save all of my correctness for the office, which will, of course, benefit you over the next 45 minutes or so. All right, let's talk about what we're going to talk about. So the summary of the presentation is essentially I'm going to talk to you about the business cycle. We are in a very long rising trend, as Patty said. It's near record territory, but as with all good things, it is going to come to an end. And we expect the peak in the U.S. economic business cycle to occur in the first half of this year, and for the economy to slow for the remainder of 2019 and into 2020. Depending on the part of the economy in which you play, whether it's consumer-focused or industrial-focused, your outlook is slightly different. We do expect some mild recessionary activity in the first half of next year for manufacturing companies, for oil and gas companies, for mining and utility companies. But the consumer side of the economy, as I'll show you, is expected to not go through negativity. It will have a lull, so to speak, a slowdown, perhaps a chance for many of you to catch your breath after the long extended growth streak, and really a chance for you to start thinking about how do I prepare my business and my personal finances for the next rising streak in the U.S. economy, for the next period of accelerating growth that we expect to occur in the second half of 2020 and into 2021. I think it's a healthy pullback, but it's going to be mild, it's going to be brief, and really gives you a chance to catch your breath. We know it's coming because we see it already happening in much of the rest of the world. You look to Canada, Europe, Asia, most of those places are already slowing down. And really what happens with the major kind of issues that are being driven in the political arena, things like trade uncertainty and further tariffs, that's going to be the big X factor today and this year as a whole that I believe will influence whether or not we do go through this soft landing by late 2019 or early 20, or if we actually find ourselves in a little bit more of a negative environment by the time we get to that time frame. The devil's in the details, of course, and we'll discuss those subjects in much more clarity. But more importantly, I want to share with you the tools that we use to look to the future. I'll teach you about how to leverage leading economic indicators to predict both near-term and longer-term out what to expect for your own markets and for your own business performance. So hang on, it's going to be a wild ride. Let's start by looking at macroeconomic trends, the kind of the big picture view of the U.S. economy. And the best way, in my opinion, to do that is by looking at our gross domestic product. So I'm showing you this data in two different ways on this chart. On the left-hand side is the value of the U.S. economy plotted over time. On the right-hand side is the rate of change. We use something called the 312, that is basically taking the last quarter of data and comparing it to the same quarter from a year ago. And by looking at that line, you can see that the dark blue line has been above zero for nearly 10 years, as Patty mentioned. But I want to start before that. Look to the 2008-2009 period. On the left-hand side, you can see that dip in the value of our economy. That is the Great Recession. On the right-hand side of the chart, the blue line does dip below zero and represents a nearly 5% contraction in our GDP at the low point in 2009. Now, we have had this nearly record-long growth streak, expansion in the U.S. economy, but understand that the economy today is nearly 20% larger than it was at the peak before the Great Recession. That's one of those things that we don't hear about a lot. We hear about the fact that growth has been anemic or below average, that we haven't been living up to our potential, but the reality is we are much larger as an economy today than we were 10 years ago, and that deserves recognition. The United States, in addition to being the largest economy in the world, has some very unique qualities that many other countries, including in the developed world, don't share. I'll give you a few examples. So think about our geographic location on the map. We are buffered on both coastlines by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and we have friendly, non-threatening neighbors in Canada and Mexico to the north and south. In other words, we're under no imminent danger of invasion or war unless, of course, we decide to embroil ourselves in one. That's a big plus. Many countries around the world don't have that sense of stability, that consistency. On top of that, we have one of the widest, if not the widest, and deepest financial markets and capital markets in the world. And when you combine that idea with the sense that we are risk takers at heart, it really stimulates new business creation and new product development and new ideas. We are what drives innovation forward for much of the rest of the world. You compare us to someone like a Germany or a Japan, other developed economies, they're much more conservative in their nature. Furthermore, we talk about our education system, and I agree, K through 12 education does need quite a bit of work, but when you look at universities, we've got 8 of the top 10 universities in the world. The only top 10 universities that are not here in the US are Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. I mean, the list is obviously very numerous. MIT, Harvard, Yale, Boston University, Columbia, it's on and on. And the reason why that's important is that most of the rest of the world wants to send its best and brightest to get educated here. And many times, those people end up staying and contributing to this wonderful melting pot that is the U.S. economy. So we've got these unique factors that really go into our favor, and I believe are going to provide a lot of long road prosperity for the United States economy. That doesn't mean that we're not going to have difficult periods. I'll talk to you about the 2030s, which is expected to be a very difficult period economically speaking, but long term, there is sustained profitability and sustained growth expected for the U.S. economy. If you look back to the chart, on the far right-hand side is our forecast. So you can see we are expecting a cyclical peak, meaning the acceleration of economic growth rate is going to top out, and the growth rates will start to decelerate over the course of this year. If you look towards the bottom right-hand side, you can see we're expecting a 0.5% GDP growth rate for the United States for 2019 as a whole. So, as I mentioned earlier, a lull in economic activity, slower growth, but still expansion nonetheless. And then as we look towards 2021 and beyond that, there is certainly a return of the kind of growth rates that we're experiencing today. So, in other words, nothing overly scary for the U.S. economy for the next 2 to 3 years. You can plan with confidence. You can expect that although things might slow down for you a little bit, generally speaking, business conditions will remain favorable to growth. I also want you to understand how much opportunity there is. So what I'm showing you in this chart are the individual states, and I'm treating them as if they were their own country economies and ranking them versus other economies from all around the world. In other words, what I'm saying here is if California was its own economy, it would be the 6th largest economy in the world. Texas would be number 10, New York State would be number 12, and Florida would be number 17. So when you think about the potential for opportunity, the growth prospects that you have for your own business, Colorado being ranked 41st in the world is nothing to scoff at. That means even as things slow down, there will be opportunities for you to pursue. You have to be strategic. You have to be selective. You have to be able to recognize those opportunities when they rear their heads. But there is still an opportunity to continue growing your business. You just have to understand that the slowdown is going to mean you're going to have to work a little harder to capture those opportunities. The economy in general will not be as much of a tailwind in your sales as it was in 2017 and 2018, and will become a little bit more of a headwind, especially if you're kind of in the more industrial side of the U.S. economy. Think about it this way. If you are selling in California, in Texas, and Florida combined, that's a $5 trillion potential marketplace. So if you think you've found all the opportunities, if you've found all the chances to grow your market share or to introduce new products into complementary markets, I assure you, you have not. So start asking yourself the question, I have been in kind of cruise control mode. Now, what do I need to do to stand out? What do I need to do to really set myself apart? What kind of competitive advantages am I going to need to leverage as the U.S. economy slows over the next 12, maybe 18 months? Because your customers are going to be looking to you to differentiate yourself. And that's going to be key in seizing those opportunities that will be available as the economy slows down. Here, I'm showing you the cyclical relationship between the U.S. GDP and the Colorado GSP. That's the gross state product. And the reason I want to show you this is the prospects for the national economy and the performance of the local economy are actually quite in sync with one another. You can see the low points and the high points tend to happen typically at the same time. You can see the long rising streak in the blue line on the far right-hand side and the corresponding rising streak in the orange line for Colorado. The reason why this is important is as we expect the U.S. economy to peak and to start slowing down, that is a similar expectation that we have for the great state of Colorado, that you will also see your economic activity slow. It's not going to contract, but certainly the growth rates that you've been able to enjoy for the last 18 to 24 months are going to be a little bit unattainable. Unless, of course, you go out and differentiate yourself and do the things that I mentioned that you should be doing prior to that. The other thing I want you to be aware of is how important each and every person in this room is in terms of driving the U.S. economy forward. The money that you spend eating out at restaurants, going to the movies with your family and friends, buying clothing, electronics, cars, furniture, all the things we consume in our daily lives, that makes up 2/3 of U.S. GDP. So clearly, the consumer is in the driving position of the U.S. economy. Now, the other two components are also important. Government spending and business investment are also quite critical to performance, but they are, relatively speaking, much smaller components of the U.S. economy. Now, if you are, of course, a manufacturer or you're involved in one of the industrial sectors, what really drives your business is that business investment category. And so the consumer might be doing fine and well, but that doesn't truly reflect the reality in which you live. And so I wanted to show you the difference between the consumer segment of the economy, which is essentially what represents GDP, and the industrial segment. So I've plotted something called the U.S. Industrial Production Index for you here in the same way that we looked at GDP. Notice a couple of important differences. First, the Great Recession. It was a much more significant contraction in the industrial economy at that time. The decline was nearly 15% at the low point versus just under 5% for GDP. You'll also notice that although it too had a nice recovery period, the industrial economy never really managed to surpass the pre-recession peak before entering another downturn in 2015-2016. And that was driven primarily by the collapse in oil prices from over $100 a barrel down to 26, by a decline, significant decline in steel and aluminum and all the other commodities reflective of weak industrial demand. So you can see the blue line on the far right-hand side actually, once again, dips below zero during that period of time. Now, this Industrial Production Index is our benchmark for the U.S. industrial economy, and it has now been rising for a very long period of time, more than 30 months, since its last cyclical low at the midpoint of 2016. If it continues to rise for a few more months, it will be the record longest rising streak. So understand that part of what drives this has been, I believe, tax reform. The tax reform package that we passed in late 2017 and that went into effect in early 2018 did boost some of the industrial spending, some CapEx. But in our opinion, and looking at the data that I'll show you shortly, it was a temporary boost. It was an artificial boost, and we're already starting to see the effects of that tax reform package wane. So we're not expecting a significant carryover of that positivity into 2019, contributing to our expectations of a slowdown. Here you can see also our forecast calls for those teal areas on the far right-hand side for some negativity in the first half of 2020 for the industrial economy. That is because, first of all, this is a smaller series than GDP, and second of all, it tends to go lower on the lows and higher on the highs. So if you are in manufacturing, if you are in the industrial sector, if you're part of the B2B world, you should be planning for a little bit more conservative position, a little bit more caution as you head into that late 2019, early 2020 timeframe. But the main message I want you to understand here is you have to understand which metric you should be benchmarking yourself versus. Because if you're a manufacturer and you're using GDP as a benchmark, that doesn't really make much sense. You should be looking at things like industrial production. That's a more accurate reflection of the reality in which you operate your business. So how do we know? The question is, you're talking to me about a slowdown, not a major recession, but certainly slower rates of growth. How do we know that that's what's going to happen? Well, we have this system called leading economic indicators, and I want to teach you how this works so that you can start thinking about finding leading indicators for your own business. Because I assure you, whether you're a $5 million company, a $100 million company, or a $1 billion company, depending on the markets and industries you serve, there are leading economic indicators that can predict what you should be able to expect over the next 12, 24, even as far as 36 months into the future. So let me show you how this works. The blue line here is the rate of change, the year-over-year growth rate for a particular set of sample industry data. The orange line is a leading economic indicator. And you can see there that the peak in the orange line occurs in May 2010, but the peak in the blue line doesn't happen until May of 2011. That suggests that there is a 12-month lead time between the orange line and the blue line. Now, you can see that relationship consistently hold true through the various low points and high points in those two series. So what that allows us to do is we can take the latest 12 months of data, so going back to December of 2017, This is actually historic data. This is not a guess or a forecast or a conjecture. This has already taken place. And we can physically take that orange line and push it, aligning the low points of the two series and leveraging the last 12 months of data in that orange line to predict with a high degree of confidence what the blue line is going to do. And I, again, assure you that regardless of what market you're in or what industry you serve, there are series that will have this type of relationship to your own business when you look at it on a rate of change basis. So taking this approach, how is it that we know that the U.S. economy is going to slow and perhaps even have some negativity? Well, here I'm showing you that, again, that industrial production index. The solid blue line is historic data. The dots are our forecast for the next 12 quarters. Why is it that we think there's going to be this peak in the cycle and then a period of slowing economic growth? Well, we have a body of evidence. The first one I want to show you is the pink line. That is the G7 leading indicator. In here, I'm using the 112 rate of change, or the month-over-month growth rate. And this encompasses basically the major economies around the world. The U.S. is part of this, but so is Great Britain and Germany and France and Japan. And this has clearly already gone through the peak and has started to decelerate. In fact, it is now in negative territory, below the zero line. If we look to U.S. leading indicators, one of my favorites is the Purchasing Managers Index, which really, I believe, reflects optimism about future purchasing behaviors. You can see it too clearly has peaked, and really with the last few months of data has gone into significant decline. That too points to the fact that the current acceleration in the U.S. economy is not going to be sustainable for much longer. The stock market is not always the best indicator. It doesn't always match, but it does have pretty good predictive abilities. And you can see the blue line, which is the Wilshire Market Cap 312, or the quarter-over-quarter growth rate, too has ended its upward momentum and has transitioned to the backside of the cycle. And finally, the JP Morgan Manufacturing Indicator also confirms this view that the peak is imminent and we will be seeing slower growth rates as we go through 2019 and early 2020. But again, wouldn't it be amazing to figure out what leading indicators are there for your company or for your industry, to be able to predict with a high degree of confidence what you can expect? That would be a huge boost in the quality and the timing of the decisions that you're making. But the key that you have to understand is, what is the timing relationship? How predictive is this series to my business? And of course, you want to have a high correlation to go with that. So we actually have a great tool that I wanted to make you aware of. It's called DataCast. You can go on itreconomics.com. You can upload your own data, and the tool will actually suggest leading indicators for your business based on your performance over the last 5, 7, perhaps 10 years. If you're interested in learning more about this, I highly recommend you check out this DataCast tool that we've developed. Here, just some additional global leading indicators: the Eurozone Composite PMI, the EU Manufacturing PMI, and the JP Morgan Global Manufacturing PMI. They're all in the red. They're all negative. All of them confirm this notion that the global economy is already in the process of slowing down. We just haven't felt it yet because of the kind of this 6-month artificial rising trend that we created for ourselves through tax reform. You know, when I look at this type of stuff, I'm convinced that every person in this room gets up every morning and you work hard and you do everything you can to be successful. But this quote really sums it up nicely in my mind. It's not enough to do your best. You must know what to do and then do your best. And I believe these leading indicators can be that missing piece for you that will help you do the best and for your companies to become the best versions of themselves. Actually, it reminds me of an interesting story. When we first arrived in the United States from the Soviet Union in 1990, we were introduced to a local family whose job it was to help us get acclimated to our new environment. They want us integrated into society as quickly as possible. And so the family spent the first couple of weeks showing us around kind of the neighborhood, where the schools were, where the grocery store was, how to drive, on the streets of our neighborhood. And then eventually, as we got more comfortable with that, this family felt like it was their duty as native Texans to introduce us to the Texas culture. And so what better way of doing that than to take us to the rodeo? So I want to paint this picture for you. I'm 10 years old. My family and I are essentially fresh off the boat. We speak no English. And I'm sitting there at the rodeo thinking to myself, why would human beings be wrestling with cows? Like, what is the end game here? I don't understand. But, you know, having a good time nonetheless. We get to the intermission portion. They make some sort of announcement that I don't comprehend, but I see kids of various ages making their way down to the rodeo floor. And the mother from this family is nudging me in the back that I should also go down to the floor of the rodeo. I'm a relatively easygoing guy, so I say, fine, I'll go check this out. I make my way down, and I'm standing there in the dirt in a group of kids, of about 20 kids, ranging in age from maybe 7 to 8 on the younger side, 15 to 16 on the older side. The younger kids I notice are dressed like me in casual street clothes, but the older kids are very serious about this rodeo business, right? They've got the full getup, the hats and the belt buckles and the boots with the spurs. Again, I don't judge, to each his own. They ring a bell, they open a door on the far side of the rodeo, and a calf is let in. Now, as soon as this happens, the entire group of children, except for myself, who's totally clueless as to what's going on, they start to run towards the animal. Well, you can imagine the cow isn't just going to stand there idly by as this horde of children descends upon it. So it starts to run away from the crowd alongside the perimeter wall of the arena. And at this point, I'm starting to pick up some context clues. I notice that on one of its horns is a ribbon. And so I'm thinking, I bet they're after that ribbon. So I make an immediate decision and a full commitment, and I start to run from the center of the rodeo floor to intercept this calf at a perpendicular angle. But as I'm careening towards it, I'm thinking, holy cow, this is a big animal. Like, what am I going to do when I actually get there, right? And the only thing that comes to my mind is I lower my shoulder and I slam into the side of this calf, smashing it against the rodeo wall. It falls over, its legs are kicking wildly in the air, but I bend down and I snatch that ribbon right off of its horn, and I'm standing there all proud. Well, as you can imagine, the audience is shocked, right? They've never seen this strategy implemented at the rodeo before. Eventually, there's some mild applause. I'm thinking, okay, maybe I did the right thing, not sure. The group of kids come over. The younger ones are patting me on the back, which I understand. The older ones, on the other hand, are saying things like, man, this is bullshit, right? Look at this guy. What is he doing, right? But because I don't speak any English, my response is, yeah. So the announcer person comes out. They give me the microphone, expecting me to have a victory speech for the crowd. And the only thing that comes to my mind is, this is bullshit, right? Totally true story. I'm not making this up. My prize was $20 in Whataburger gift certificates. And so that's the first place we ever ate out in the United States of America. But the reason why I like telling this story is, you know, these leading indicators, this stuff, it works. It's not bullshit, guys. If you implement it, it will help you make better decisions as you move forward. All right. Let's keep going. Tax reform. I mentioned tax reform a couple of times. I want to take a minute to dispel a couple of myths. So the first idea behind tax reform was we lower corporate taxes, they stimulate CapEx, and we have this boost in economic activity because of additional spending. The historic data simply doesn't support that. So the blue line here shows you the average corporate tax rate in America going all the way back to 1960. You can see between 60 and 84, it was 48% on average. Then the Reagan administration enacted some tax cuts, and they brought it down to 35%. And of course, you can see the latest dip there from 35% down to 21%. But look at the orange line at the bottom. That is the percentage of our economic activity that is represented by business investment. And you can see, although it does oscillate a little bit, generally speaking, it does not move based on what the corporate tax rate is. It is typically around 12 to 13% of our economic activity. And so expecting this huge boost in CapEx is, I'm not sure what data it's based upon, but certainly there's not a historic precedent for that. And more importantly, it is not the official corporate tax rate that drives investment decisions. Because you can see here, it hasn't made much of a difference over the last 70 years. What is important is the effective corporate tax rate. And based on some loopholes and some write-offs and parking profits overseas, American companies have been paying an effective tax rate between 15 and 20% for the last 2 decades. It has not been 35%. Now, yes, this tax reform package lowered the official tax rate, but it also got rid of a lot of those loopholes and ways for companies to lower their taxable income. So it's actually quite feasible that corporations, some companies, may pay more in taxes as a result of this change. What is clear is that there has not been a whole lot of evidence that companies are using this to invest more aggressively. The Atlanta Federal Reserve survey showed that only about 10% of businesses plan to increase their capex by 15% or more based on the changes in the corporate tax structure. What we have seen is that companies, especially larger corporations that can really move the needle, they've been buying back stock and they've been paying out dividends because people behave the way that they are incentivized to. And the boards of these companies, the decision makers, they are paid compensated primarily in stock. And so they will do whatever they can to support the stock price so that their own compensation is higher. So this has not had the type of desired effect. It has had a little bit of a boost. I don't want to take anything away from it. Certainly other components of tax reform, for example, accelerated depreciation, that was a nice little gem in there that not many people talk about. Basically, companies can now write off 100% of either a new or a used asset purchase in the first year of that purchase. That's a pretty significant enticement, but the challenge with that is it wasn't limited to 2018. They have 5 years to take advantage of that, so there wasn't the urgency to start going out there and spending money. So we have seen this boost, as I mentioned. The best way for me to illustrate it to you is by showing you this series. This is called Non-Defense Capital Goods New Orders Without Aircraft. It's a fancy name for a very simple subject, business-to-business activity in this country. On the bottom of this chart are the moving totals for the index, but I want you to concentrate on the 2 lines on top. The blue line is the year-over-year growth rate. The orange line is the quarter-over-quarter growth rate. That orange line has about a 6-month predictive lead time to the blue line. You can see it has already peaked and it has downward passed that blue line, which means that over the next 6 months, you are likely to see a further deceleration of business-to-business spending on an annualized basis in this country. So that means that whatever boost we were able to see has already started to tail off. The rates of change on an annual basis are starting to drop off. We expect that to continue over the course of 2019. The other flip side of the coin with tax reform is the cost, right? And the cost is an important thing for us all to consider. Here, I'm showing you things that the government is willing to deal with and is not able to deal with. So the red line there are basically the fixed expenses. It's Social Security, it's Medicare, it's Medicaid. Okay? The blue line is income for the government. That's tax receipts. And you can see it already has started to tail off because of lower personal and business taxes. So what I want you to understand is that the gap that exists between the red and the blue line shows you that America as a country is living above its means, beyond its means. And that is not a long-term sustainable situation. And that is even before we factor in the orange line, which is variable expenses, things like, defense and education and science, things that we don't have to spend money on, but certainly hope to continue spending money on, and the green line, which is the cost of our existing national debt, which is now north of $20 trillion. So really, to get a true sense of where we are fiscally speaking, you've got to stack the orange and the green lines on top of the red line, and then measure the gap between that and the blue line. And this is the reason, guys, why we are facing nearly $1 trillion budget deficits today, and they're expected to grow as we get into the 2020s. This is a real issue that we've got to find some solutions for. If you look at our debt today, in terms of measuring it as debt versus GDP, we're at 120.5%. The last time we were this high was in the mid-1940s. What was going on at that time? World War II, right? So in my mind, it makes sense to take on a bunch of debt when you're fighting to preserve your way of life, to fight an oppressive Nazi regime. Yeah, let's take on debt and win that battle. But when the economy is already humming along at a 2.5%, 3% growth, do we want to add another $1.5 trillion to our debt in order to extend that rising streak? In my opinion, probably not, but I'll let you be the judge for yourself. The basic gist that I'm trying to communicate to you here is this has got to change. We've got to start taking some steps to address this, because in addition to the national debt, there are other major changes going on in our country. Demographics. 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every single day for the next decade. That's going to place huge stress on entitlements, on healthcare costs. It will certainly boost inflation over this period of time. This is why we're expecting a very, very difficult time in the U.S. economy when we get into the 2030s. Okay? That is the peak of the baby boomer retirement. By the time we get into 2036, over half of the baby boomers will have, let's say, sailed off into the sunset. So the pressure will ease a little bit. But the first half of the 2030s at least will be an extremely difficult time in our economic future. I will say Great Depression-like economic time. So not 08, 09, I'm talking about 1929, unless, of course, we start changing the things that we're doing. And there are things that we can change. We can make some tweaks to Social Security that can extend its viability for 20 or 50 years, right? We can start making some concessions now in terms of taxes that will alleviate the problem. But the issue is the current government politicians are much more concerned on preserving their own place and their own salaries rather than addressing the real problems that this country faces. Now, we're starting to see kind of a changing of the guard, right? AOC with her 70% tax rate proposal, but even some of the more tenured members of the Democratic Party are starting to say, let's address some of these things. Let's start thinking about the future. Let's not just kick that proverbial can down the road. And I believe that we will see that evolution. But given the status quo and the unwillingness of the political establishment to do the necessary things, the depression drivers are going to continue to unfold as we expect. Okay? So, what does that mean? How do you prepare yourself and your business? What do you tell your children who are likely going to be early on in their careers or just entering the job market at that time? Number one, easy to say, hard to do, live below your means. Whatever you think you're saving, save more, right? Do not fall victim to entitlement thinking. I think that exists to a great extent in the United States, where people feel like I deserve it, therefore I should have it. Okay? Live below your means. Number two, learn a second language. Make your skill set marketable and diverse so that if opportunities are not there for you in the United States in the early 2030s, you can leverage foreign companies. It's not all going to unfold the same way around the globe. Whether it's Spanish or French or even Chinese, think about picking up a second language. It's going to be a great benefit to you down the road. Number three, multiple and diverse income streams. Basic comment here, date someone in your office, but don't marry them. It's very simple, right? Okay? Marry someone from a different industry because you want to diversify. Don't want to have your eggs in one basket, okay? This goes along with choose careers oriented towards the opportunities. So I'm talking about education, I'm talking about technology, healthcare. These are the things that are still going to be very much in need and in demand even when the economy is struggling. So think about advising your children and young people all around you to think about what opportunities are there. Underwater basket weaving is probably not going to be a good solution. You know, just getting a college degree and taking on $100K worth of debt to say you have a diploma, not the smartest thing to do in my opinion. It's got to be geared towards the opportunities that will be there. Pay off as much debt. This is simple logic again, but you don't want to have any variable interest debt. You don't want to have any debt at all if you can swing it, because debt means liabilities. It means stress for you at that time. The less debt you have at that point in your life, the better. And it will also allow you to be ready to buy at the price cycle low. This is one of the great fallacies, that recessions are terrible things. Recessions are the best opportunities you have for wealth creation, okay? And the Great Depression of 2030s will present an unprecedented kind of wealth generation event if you know it's coming, if you're positioned correctly, and if you're ready to pull the trigger when asset prices all fall. Think about the people that did that in 08, 09. People that have a lot of cash on hand, very little debt. They snapped out businesses and property and all sorts of assets for pennies on the dollar, and think about where they are today. It's really stark, but recessions are one of the best growth opportunities if you plan for it and if you're positioned correctly to take advantage of it. And finally, be self-reliant. It's a very simple thing. Don't rely upon other people. If you are self-reliant, that it's going to carry you well. So here's what I'm going to say. Is it for sure that this Great Depression is going to happen? No, probably not. But if you do these things yourself and you tell your children, you will still be better off, regardless of what turns out. So there's really no reason not to behave in this fiscally responsible manner for yourself. All right. I don't have much time, and there's still quite a bit to cover, so I want to move on to tariffs and trade. I think this is the big X factor for 2019. And then first, I want to show you why. Why are we doing this right now? Two reasons. Number one, it was a fundamental promise of the Trump administration's campaign in 2016, and they're doing what they said that they would do. Number two, if you look at our deficit with our trading partners, it continues to get worse and worse and really picked up momentum in late 2017 and over the course of 2018. As of right now, it's more than $600 billion. That is the trade deficit we have with many of our trading partners. More than half of that is with China. So what have we done? We've implemented some tariffs. I'm showing you two bar charts here. On the left-hand side, there are two categories. The actual ones, the ones that are already in place. You can see we have tariffs on washing machines, solar panels, steel, aluminum, and about $250 billion worth of products that we import from China. In response to this, the Chinese have reciprocated and have passed about $112 billion worth of American products that are now under their own import tariff. But beyond this, and really the X factor here is what do we do moving forward? Will we raise the tariff on the $200 billion basket of Chinese goods from 10% to 25% in early March if a trade deal doesn't get done? Will we consider these additional ones? Another $270 billion worth of Chinese products could be tariffed, and beyond that, about $350 billion worth of automotive products. The Automotive Trade Association has shown that if we do move forward with this additional tariff on both new cars and car parts, it will take the average selling price of a new car from $35K today to over $40K. And the reason why that's important is demand is elastic, guys. What that means is when things get more expensive, we buy less of those things. It's very simple logic. So we have to be very careful about treading this path. We have to be very strategic. You know, we talk about fair trade, but what is fair trade? Is fair trade in American perspective the same thing as fair trade for Europe or for China? Probably not. In general, we're not advocates of fair trade at ITR. What we are advocates of is competition and specialization, doing the things that you are best at rather than supporting industries that would flounder otherwise. I'm talking about steel. I'm talking about copper. I'm talking about coal. Okay? So when you think about the Cadillac, right? If you were to buy a Cadillac in the 1980s, you were making a statement. That statement was, I'm going to die soon, right? It was a status thing, right? But if you buy a Cadillac today, it is because of the technology. It's because of the design. It's because of the comfort. It's the competition and specialization that Cadillac was forced upon because of these foreign imports coming in without a tariff that made it be the company that it is today. And so we are very much pro that, rather than free trade or fair trade, as some would say. But let's explore some of the consequences, okay? So we've imposed all of these tariffs on China, and clearly, on paper, we can hurt them more than they can hurt us. Our exports to China account for less than 1% of our economy. Their exports to the U.S. account for nearly 4% of their economy. So on paper, sure, we can hurt them a little bit more. But it's never that simple, because their reciprocal tariffs have targeted some of the largest exports in the U.S. manufacturing sector: aerospace, semiconductors, agriculture, motor vehicles, oil and gas, and so on. And so surely there will be some potential consequences. Inflation is a very basic one, and because of the elasticity of demand, there will be lower production. But in my opinion, it's actually the intangible things. It's things like the supply chain. When you look at these sectors, semiconductors, aerospace, very fragile supply chains in some cases. If a company in that sector goes out of business, that can have devastating consequences. And the reason why this is important is because if you look at the #1 export of most American states, it's exactly those categories. So blue here, that's aerospace. Computer processors is teal. Cars is green. And this shows that it's not just that particular industry gets affected, it's the entire state economy. It's the housing market, it's automotive sales, it's retail sales. So we have to be very careful in the way that we move forward with this. We also have to understand that the Chinese are approaching this from a much longer time frame. Their decisions are based on their Plan 2030, Plan 2040, Plan 2050. Our decisions, in my observation at least, seem to be based primarily on the next election cycle, whether that's mid-years or the presidential election. President Xi of China is likely to rule for decades. He's thinking, I can outlast the next 2 or 4 years or whatever, or 6 years, whatever I need to do, and maybe the next administration will have a different approach. So we have to take a much more long-term strategic approach to our position on trade. Here, this is why it's important to Colorado. Computer and electronic products, 24% of your exports. Food manufacturing, 21%. Machinery, 10%. These are important sectors that are being affected. So if you yourself are not feeling the pressure from tariffs right now, think about, what about my customers? What about my customers' customers? How do I pivot and deploy resources effectively to take advantage of the best opportunities that are out there? Because not all aspects of your business are going to be performing the same as you move forward into 2019 and certainly into 2020. Here are just some few examples of the companies that are going to be raising their prices, either already have done so or are planning on it based on the tariff behavior. So the key message I want to communicate to you is be prepared for prices to go up, okay, in the stuff that you buy in your daily life. Now, it won't be as much pressure as we saw in 2018, but certainly inflationary pressure is still going to be there for you over the course of 2019. Now, interest rate policy has historically been the way that the Fed keeps a lid on inflation. And here I'm showing you that there's a very clear way to tell what interest rates are going to do. It's based clearly on the height of the Federal Reserve chair that's in power at that time. Very simple, right? Volcker at 6'2", high rates. Janet Yellen, lowest rates in a long, long period of time. So now we've got Mr. Powell. Where are rates going to go up, right? It's only one direction. You think he did 4 rate hikes last year because he wanted to? He had to. He's a taller guy, right? In reality, though, we tend to listen to the Fed in terms of their projections. And so we've clearly seen a little bit of a tempering, right? I talked to you about pricing. We don't have nearly as much inflationary component this year as we did last year. Commodity prices are already starting to retreat a little bit. Copper, for instance, is known to have a PhD in economics because it's so diversely used in many different sectors like automotive and electronics and construction and all of these things that we buy. Copper is currently down 15% year over year, or roughly thereabout. And so that shows that some pressures are starting to ease. And you can see that, these dots in this chart represent where each regional Fed chair president expects interest rate policy to finish that particular year. So some of them are tempering their expectations. In general, they're still expecting 1, maybe 2 rate hikes this year. If we see a deterioration of economic conditions, I feel like they will take their foot off the pedal, and we might not have any rate hikes this year. It's very difficult to tell, but there's certainly not nearly as much pressure on them because inflationary pressures are starting to wane a little bit. So we've covered a great deal of material today. I want to put it into simple terms for you. Here is the U.S. economic business cycle. It is repeatable, it is consistent. There are 4 phases. The green area, that's where we were in 2018. That is called phase B. It's accelerating economic growth. Positive rates of change that are increasing over time. That period is coming to a close. We are about to go through the peak and transition to the yellow part, which is phase C, slowing economic growth. So still expansion in the economy and many U.S. markets, many verticals, but at slower rates of change than what we saw in 2018. And depending on the industry and the markets that you serve, there is the potential for some negativity as we get into that early part of 2020, especially if you're in heavy industry or in manufacturing. There's some mild, maybe 2 to 3 quarters of negative year-over-year performance. It's brief, it's short-lived, and it turns right around and heads back north for 2021. Okay? So what should you do? I wanted to give you some specific pieces of advice. I deleted the ones that are not relevant. Here is what you have to do. Focus on the segments of your business that tend to do best during periods of economic slowdown. leverage your own data. Look at past performance. Look at where you were when the economy was slowing down and what did the best in your business, and then focus your sales efforts, your marketing activities, your promotional initiatives on those parts of your business. Go for the lowest hanging fruit, in other words. But a part of that will be knowing what competitive advantages will resonate with your customers when they're starting to become a little bit more conservative, a little bit less optimistic about the future. What selling proposition are you going to attack with that will guarantee that you win that business? Start thinking a little bit more conservative notion in terms of cash management. Start building up that cash reserve. Certainly, inventory control should tighten up a little bit. But equally important is, what should you not be doing? Look at your business and figure out which components have not been doing well for you, and then cut the losers. Deceleration in the business cycle does not allow you to waste your time on products and services that have not been doing well. You've got to be selective, okay? And finally, and most importantly, develop your own data. Your own rates of change have great insight potential. Your own 3-12-12-12 will tell you where you're headed over the next 6 months. Your own leading indicators will tell you where you're headed over the next year or 2 years or 3 years. If you need help, we're here for you at ITR. Certainly feel free to contact us. If not, have your own team internally do this, because it will dramatically improve your decision making. So with that, guys, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Feel free to follow us on Twitter, or we have a newsletter. If you want, we're offering a free 90-day subscription to our cornerstone publication called the Trends Report. You just have to send a quick text message there. But again, thank you so much for your time. Really grateful. Appreciate it.